Welcome back to Freedom Friday, where we explore counter narratives of faith and resilience. Today, we highlight the story of a man who defied the wrath of ruthless and corrupt men of power to save the life of God's prophet and preserve his message for the people of his time and ours. He is the man the Bible refers to as Ebed Melech, the Cushite. It's Jerusalem in 588 BC. The dread of invasion was in the air. Enemy troops were massing outside the city. Food was becoming increasingly scarce. People scurried through the streets, estimating their best chance of surviving the coming bloodbath. Groups of individuals could be seen at the street corners discussing the latest news. I hear the Babylonians are as cruel as the Assyrians, one said. They could rape our women and dash our children against the wall. But where are the Egyptians, our allies? The king promised they would return to help us, said another one. Keep your voice down, someone replied. There are spies everywhere. I'm taking my family and fleeing to Egypt. We think it's our best hope, our only hope, in fact, of survival. Smoke from altars to various gods rose up from the Temple of Solomon, already stripped of its grandeur from a previous invasion. Many homes had their own idols as the worship of Yahweh declined. It was a dark time. Jerusalem had in effect almost become a pagan city. One lone figure. In the midst of all of this, one lone figure hurried through the anxiety-laden streets on a mercy mission. A black court official, Ebed Melech, headed for the Benjamin Gate, where he knew the king was settling disputes. The Anchor Bible Dictionary tells us that this Cushite was an extremely important official. This is supported by the fact that the term used to describe Ebed Melech, in fact it's the meaning of his name, servant of the king, was used to refer to high-ranking officers. The dictionary notes, amid the confusion of the bewildering times that tormented King Zedekiah, he found in this loyal servant a refreshing confidence. Another reputable source, Erdman's Dictionary of the Bible, makes a crucial observation on this issue. It notes, traditionally, scholars have assumed that he was Zedekiah's slave, but the king's acquiescence to his request would be an unusual response to a slave's criticism. The phrase servant of the king occurs on numerous seals from 7th century Judah, where it refers to high-ranking officials. Erdman's also suggests he may have been head, that is Ebed Melech, may have been head of an Egyptian Cushite military unit in Jerusalem at the time. Clearly, though, this was an individual of significant standing in the king's service. Moreover, his name, Ebed Melech, was a Hebrew name, which makes him one of the first black Hebrew Cushites identified as such in the scripture. But at that moment, he was on an urgent rescue mission. Word had reached him in the palace earlier that a group of leaders had gone to the king demanding punishment for the prophet Jeremiah. He had been fearless in delivering Yahweh's message to the king and the people of Jerusalem that the best course of action was to surrender to Babylon. This was God's judgment on the nation for the wholesale rejection of his worship. But to a people steeped in idol worship, the prophet's words fell on deaf ears. More to the point, this unpopular message calling for surrender to their enemy put Jeremiah squarely in the crosshairs of the king's military leaders and advisors whose only aim was to maintain their positions of power and influence. They branded Jeremiah a traitor and demanded suitable punishment. The king, a weak and vacillating leader, intimidated by his officials, gave them permission to do whatever they wanted with the prophet. With a shudder, Ebed Melech recalled the news he heard that the men had dropped Jeremiah into a cistern. This repulsive act was designed to inflict maximum torture on the divine messenger. Many of the cisterns were without water. Instead, they contained thick layers of mud. And with nowhere to sit or rest, being thrown into one of these cisterns was the closest thing to being buried alive. The prophet would sink slowly into the mud, and without food, the cistern would become his tomb. I have a feeling Jeremiah was not the first to suffer such a fate at the hands of these cruel and ruthless politicians. Ebed Melech, let's get back to him, quickened his steps, knowing that he did not have much time. As a true worshiper of Yahweh, he had listened to the prophet's messages and took them to heart. It saddened him that Judah had abandoned the worship of the true God to worship idols they made with their own hands, idols he had rejected himself for the worship of Yahweh. As an alien in this country, he found peace and strength in the God Jeremiah preached, and he committed himself to be faithful despite the danger from his fellow leaders in the palace. Their only concern was wealth and power. In the face of the obvious danger from the invading Babylonians, they refused to surrender and spare the population the destruction that would follow. Instead, they pinned their hopes on the Egyptians to come to their aid and leave them in power. Ebed Melech trusted in Yahweh and performed his duties as best he could. He reflected on how far one could fall once they turned away from the worship of the true God. Now, the entire nation was in peril. Reaching the Benjamin Gate, he hurried to the king and pleaded for Jeremiah's life. He denounced the wickedness of the officials in throwing the prophet into a cistern where he would suffer an agonizing death by starvation. King Zedekiah did recognize Jeremiah as God's messenger, but he was fearful of the backlash from his corrupt officials if he attempted to follow the prophetic instruction. But still, somehow, he summoned the courage and gave Ebed Melech permission to take 30 men for protection and free the prophet from his underground dungeon of mud. Working quickly, the Cushite gathered the men and the tools he needed to complete the job. He wrapped the rope in old clothing to save the prophet from rope burn, dropped it down into the cistern, and instructed the prophet to place the loop under his arms. The men pulled, and soon Jeremiah lay panting on the ground of the courtyard. No doubt Ebed Melech gave thanks he was in time to save his life. He knew that in preserving the prophet's life, he was exposing himself to the hatred of those who would try to kill him. The anger directed at Jeremiah would now be redirected to him. His life was now in danger, but Ebed Melech decided it was worth the risk so that Yahweh's message would be given to the city. He believed it was their only hope of surviving the coming crisis. Jeremiah, on his part, must have been so grateful for the actions of this brave and faithful servant of Yahweh, who, although a foreigner, was more faithful than his countrymen who were supposed to be the chosen people. But beyond Jeremiah, Yahweh himself took note of Ebed Melech's actions on behalf of his prophet. The prophet's message was not only for those of his time, but contained messages for his people of all time, right down to our day. Today, we still read Jeremiah's prophecies as one of the great prophets of Israel. But without this Cushite Yahweh might have had to choose another vessel. It is no wonder that Yahweh sent Jeremiah with a message to Ebed Melech. And we conclude this amazing story with God's message through Jeremiah to his servant Ebed Melech. Go and say to Ebed Melech the Cushite, thus saith the Lord of hosts, I will surely save you, and you shall not fall by the sword. Because you have put your trust in me, declares the Lord. Ebed Melech's faithfulness and his willingness to stand for truth and righteousness and justice is a powerful reminder that our actions must be consistent with our convictions even when faced with dire consequences. Notice the reason God gives for saving Ebed Melech. Not necessarily so much for saving Jeremiah's life, but because God said, you have put your trust in me. As a believer, Ebed Melech knew Jeremiah was delivering God's message, even though it was not what the people wanted to hear. Because of that belief, he acted to save the life of the prophet at the risk of his own. God knew his heart, and the color of his skin did not obscure the authenticity of his faith. It is the same today. Thanks for viewing this episode of Freedom Friday. If the story of Ebed Melech stimulated your thoughts and your faith, go ahead and subscribe. Like and share it with others who you think might benefit. Until our next episode then, stay strong, stay faithful, and stay free. This is Freedom Friday, where we tell the whole story.